They called her Grease Girl Marcus Wellington. The billionaire's son laughed when Abigail Harper walked into the hangar with oil-stained coveralls. He didn't know that this simple mechanic was about to take control of his Black Hawk helicopter and make him beg for mercy in a deadly snowstorm. Marcus had bought his officer rank with his father's money, thinking he could ignore her warnings. But when the engine dies at 8, 00 FT in storm, Helena, only Abigail's hands can save them. When Marcus begs for help, will she save him or let karma take control? What do you think? Should Abigail show mercy or let him face the consequences? Comment below. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Blackstone as Abigail Harper wiped grease from her hands with a worn rag. At 27, she had already earned the reputation as the best helicopter mechanic on the base, though few people bothered to acknowledge it. Though small in stature, Abigail's green eyes burned with determination. Her calloused hands could diagnose engine issues that stumped veterans, but few acknowledged her skills. She tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear and adjusted the old pilot badge pinned to her coveralls, the only thing left from her grandfather, who had died serving his country in the skies above Korea. Harper. The voice echoed across the hangar like a whip crack. Marcus Wellington strode through the massive doors, his perfectly pressed uniform gleaming with metals that sparkled a little too brightly in the fluorescent lighting. At 28, he possessed the kind of genetic lottery that money could enhance, 6'1" in of blonde perfection, with a jawline that belonged on magazine covers, and an ego that filled rooms before he entered them. Behind him trailed a small entourage of fellow officers, all sons of wealthy families who had found their way into military service through connections rather than conviction. "I need you to sign off on the Black Hawk maintenance report," Marcus announced, not bothering to make eye contact with Abigail. Abigail straightened up from the helicopter she had been inspecting, her expression carefully neutral. She had spent the past hour documenting a concerning vibration in the main rotor assembly, the kind of problem that could turn deadly at altitude. "Sir, I need to discuss some concerns about the engine system before I can approve." Her words were cut short as Marcus snatched the clipboard from her hands, barely glancing at her detailed notes. The charts and diagrams she had carefully prepared showed clear evidence of bearing wear that needed immediate attention, but Marcus's attention was already elsewhere, focused on the camera crew that had just entered the hangar. "Listen, wrench monkey," Marcus sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your job is fixing things, not questioning officers." Without ceremony, he tore her report in half, then quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the concrete floor like confetti, the sound of ripping paper seemed to echo in the sudden silence that filled the hangar. Several mechanics stopped their work to watch, their expressions ranging from shock to carefully hidden sympathy. The humiliation wasn't finished. Marcus grabbed a container of engine oil from a nearby workbench and deliberately upended it, letting the black liquid splash across Abigail's coveralls and pool at her feet. The laughter that erupted from his followers was sharp and ugly, filling the cavernous space with the sound of pack animals sensing weakness. "This is where you belong, Grease Girl," Marcus announced with theatrical flair, gesturing at the spreading puddle of oil. "On your knees, cleaning up messes." He turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice taking on the rehearsed cadence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. This is the difference between natural leaders and people who just fix things. Abigail knelt slowly, deliberately, her movements precise and controlled, despite the rage building in her chest like steam in a boiler. She picked up each torn piece of her report, one by one, her fingers steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The oil soaked through the knees of her coveralls, but she didn't rush, didn't show the humiliation that burned in her throat like acid around her. The hangar had gone quiet again, the weight of collective shame pressing down on everyone who watched but did nothing. She folded the torn pieces carefully and slipped them into her pocket, then rose to her feet with the dignity of someone who understood. That real strength came from within Marcus was already moving on, basking in the attention of the CNN news crew that had arrived to document his upcoming heroic mission. He straightened his uniform and adjusted the metals on his chest decorations that Abigail had noticed bore serial numbers that didn't exist in any military database. She had photographed them weeks earlier, driven by a curiosity that had served her well in her mechanical work. As Marcus began his practice speech about duty and service, Abigail quietly slipped a small piece of paper into the Black Hawk's cockpit, her movements hidden by the crowd gathered around the golden boy of Fort Blackstone. The note was simple, written in her precise handwriting. Check the engine.
You fool. It was a final warning, a last attempt to prevent the disaster she could see coming as clearly as storm clouds on the horizon. But as she watched Marcus bask in the attention of reporters and fellow officers, Abigail knew he would never.
Listen, men like Marcus Wellington didn't listen to women like her, not until it was too late. She touched her grandfather's pilot badge and whispered a quiet promise. I'll prove the Harper name means something, but Abigail didn't know that tomorrow she would take control of Marcus's destiny in ways she never could have imagined. Storm Helena was descending on the Pacific Northwest with winds over 150 mph and temperatures plummeting to 45 degrees F. Visibility was near zero in the warm safety of. The meteorology office forecasters traced the storm's path with growing concern, knowing that this was the kind of weather system that earned its own chapter in textbooks about natural disasters. But in the executive briefing room where leather chairs surrounded a polished mahogany table, the storm represented something entirely different to Marcus Wellington. He stood before a wall-mounted display showing the storm's projected path, his perfectly groomed appearance contrasting sharply with the exhausted faces of the duty officers who had been monitoring the crisis through the night. Gentlemen, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never faced real danger. This is exactly the kind of situation that separates true leaders from ordinary people. Behind him, the storm radar showed a swirling mass of destruction that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. But Marcus saw only opportunity. A children's hospital in Seattle was cut off by the storm, their critical supply running low. The only way to deliver aid was by helicopter. Military helicopters represented the only viable option for delivering the life-saving supplies. But the flight would require navigating through conditions that pushed both machine and pilot to their absolute limits. It was exactly the kind of mission that Marcus had been waiting for: high-stakes media attention and the chance to position himself as a hero in front of the cameras. Jake Morrison, a 45-year-old pilot whose weathered face told the story of 2 decades in military aviation, shifted uncomfortably. In his chair, as Marcus outlined his plan, Jake had flown through hurricanes, desert sandstorms, and mountain turbulence that would terrify commercial pilots. But something about Marcus's enthusiasm made his stomach clench with unease, so Jake interjected. Carefully, the meteorology team is recommending we wait for a break in the storm system. The winds at altitude are going to be. His words died as Marcus fixed him with the kind of stare that wealthy men used to silence inconvenient truths. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Morrison Marcus's voice carried the subtle threat of someone accustomed to destroying careers with a phone call, because I seem to remember that my family's $50 million contribution to this base came with certain expectations about the quality of personnel we maintain here. The room fell silent, except for the howl of electronics and the distant sound of wind beginning to howl around the building's corner. Jake swallowed his objections, understanding that his wife and children's future depended on his compliance with Marcus's vision of heroism. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the 35-year-old emergency physician who would accompany the mission, tried a different approach. Her years in trauma medicine had taught her to read the signs of impending disaster, and everything about this mission screamed danger. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach, "perhaps we could discuss backup safety protocols given the severity of the weather conditions." But Marcus was already turning away, his attention captured by the CNN news crew that had just been escorted into the briefing room by base security. The transformation in Marcus's demeanor was immediate and theatrical. His posture straightened, his voice took on the resonant quality of a practiced public speaker, and his smile became the kind of brilliant display that photographers love to capture. "Ladies and gentlemen of the media," he announced, "you're about to witness something special. The Wellington family doesn't just write checks. We put our lives on the line for our fellow Americans." The cameras rolled as Marcus launched into a speech about duty, courage, and the sacred trust between military and civilians. His words carefully chosen to create the kind of sound bites that would dominate news cycles. What the cameras didn't capture was the quiet conversation Marcus had with his personal aide in the corner of the room, where he outlined his plan to modify the flight path to take them directly through the storm's most photogenic sections. The original mission route had been designed for safety, skirting the worst of the weather while still accomplishing the objective. But Marcus's version would take them through mountain passes where the wind and snow would create the kind of dramatic footage that launched political careers. He had already ensured that the backup safety systems would be turned off, not because they were unnecessary, but because their warnings would create negative optics for the cameras. In the hangar below, Abigail, Harper worked frantically at her old laptop, her fingers flying across keys worn smooth by years of use. She had managed to hack into the helicopter's diagnostic system, a skill learned during countless nights teaching herself programming from library books. The data she found confirmed her worst fears. Marcus had not only ignored her warnings about the engine problems, but he had actively overridden safety protocols that should have grounded the aircraft. Her attempts to send warning emails to the base command structure met with systematic blocking, the digital equivalent of having doors slammed in her face. The final insult came when security personnel arrived to escort her from the hangar, acting on orders that came directly from Marcus's office. As they led her away, she could hear the CNN reporter interviewing Marcus about his heroic decision to risk everything for the children of Seattle. The irony was bitter as battery acid. The man who had called her just a mechanic was about to put lives at risk while ignoring the mechanical expertise that could save them. But hidden in the Black Hawk's cockpit, her note waited like a time bomb of truth. "Check the engine, you fool." 15 minutes after takeoff, Marcus would find that note just as the helicopter engine began making the exact sound she had warned about. The Black Hawk took off from Fort
Blackstone, the storm's chill already gripping the air. Jake Morrison's steady hands gripped the controls as they ascended into the chaos, but as they climbed toward their cruising altitude of
500 FT, the first wisps of cloud began to wrap around the aircraft like ghostly fingers, and Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with flying into the unknown. Marcus Wellington occupied the co-pilot's seat with the casual confidence of someone who had purchased his position rather than earned it. Through years of training and experience, his uniform remained crisp and perfectly pressed despite the increasing turbulence, and he seemed more interested in adjusting his appearance for the small camera mounted in the cockpit than in monitoring the flight instruments. Behind them, Dr. Jennifer Hayes checked and rechecked her medical supplies, her movements efficient despite the growing anxiety that knotted her stomach. The precious cargo of medicine secured in the rear compartment represented hope for dozens of children, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying into a trap that nature herself had set. The storm's outer bands hit them like a physical blow at E700 FT, sending the helicopter lurching through the air as if an invisible giant had seized it and begun shaking it like a toy. Jake's knuckles went white on the controls as he fought to maintain level flight. His years of experience automatically compensating for the violent air currents that tried to tear the aircraft apart. So he called over the increasing noise of wind and struggling engines. I'm reading some unusual vibrations in the main rotor assembly. We should consider returning to base. But Marcus was busy adjusting his position for the camera, apparently oblivious to the warning signs that were making Jake's blood run cold. It was then that Marcus noticed the small piece of paper that had somehow found its way into his seat cushion, a folded note that must have been placed there before takeoff. He unfolded it with idle curiosity, expecting perhaps a good luck message from one of his admirers. Instead, he found himself staring at 7 words written in precise feminine handwriting. "Check the engine, you fool." The color drained from his face as he recognized Abigail Harper's writing the same careful script that had filled the maintenance reports he had so casually destroyed. For the first time since takeoff, Marcus actually looked at the instrument panel, and what he saw there made his mouth go dry with terror. The engine temperature readings were climbing steadily into the red zone, and the vibration that Jake had mentioned was becoming visible in the way the instruments shook in their housings. The sound that filled the cockpit was wrong. Instead of the steady, powerful beat of a healthy helicopter, there was an underlying rhythm that spoke of metal wearing against metal, of bearings grinding themselves to destruction under the stress of flight. Marcus's hands shook as he grabbed the radio base Rescue 1. "We have technical issues." His voice trembled barely more than a whisper. The main rotor bearing, weakened by months of inadequate maintenance and pushed beyond its limits by the storm's violent air currents, chose that moment to catastrophically fail. The helicopter lurched sickeningly to one side as the rotor assembly began to tear itself apart, filling the cockpit with the sound of grinding
metal and the acrid smell of burning oil. Jake Morrison, veteran of 100 dangerous flights, fought the controls with every ounce of skill he possessed, but the laws of physics had taken command of the aircraft. "Mayday, mayday," he shouted into his headset.
"Rescue 1 is going down. Repeat, we are going down." Dr. Hayes was thrown against the cabin wall as the helicopter entered an uncontrolled spin, her medical supplies scattering across the floor in a cascade of broken glass and spilled medicine. She could see Jake slumped over the controls, blood running from a gash on his forehead where he had struck the instrument panel. During the initial lurch, Marcus was screaming into the radio with the hysteria of someone who had never faced real danger. This
Is Richard Wellington's son? I need help now. Do you understand who I am? But the storm had already claimed their radio communications, reducing his desperate pleas to static that no one would ever hear. The ground rushed up to meet them through the
swirling snow, and Jake summoned his last reserves of consciousness to pull the helicopter out of its death spiral. His final act as a pilot was to aim for a narrow ledge of rock that jutted from the mountainside, a landing spot that would kill them all if he missed by even a few feet, but their only chance of survival if his aim was true. The Black Hawk struck the ledge with the sound of tearing metal and shattering glass bouncing once before settling into a precarious position that left half the aircraft hanging over 1,000 feet drop into the valley below in the sudden silence that followed the crash, broken only by the whisper of settling snow and the tick of cooling metal. Marcus Wellington experienced his first moment
of genuine humility. The man who had bought his officer's rank with Daddy's money now sat in the wreckage of his arrogance, understanding for the first time in his privileged life that money couldn't buy him out of every situation. Dr. Hayes worked
frantically to stabilize Jake's injuries while Marcus fumbled with the emergency radio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate the simple controls. And 300 meters away in a military jail cell at Fort Blackstone, Abigail Harper heard the faint distress signal that penetrated the base's communication system, and she knew with cold certainty that she was about to take control of Marcus's fate in ways he never could have imagined. The security cell at Fort Blackstone was designed to hold soldiers who had committed minor infractions, drinking too much on liberty fighting in the enlisted club or showing up late for duty one too many times. It was not designed to contain someone with Abigail Harper's particular combination of mechanical genius and desperate determination. After her arrest, Abigail quickly assessed the cell, her mind already planning her escape. The lock mechanism was standard military issue, robust but not sophisticated, and the hair clip she had managed to conceal during her arrest would serve her purposes perfectly. The sound of the emergency alert klaxon echoing through the base corridors told her everything she needed to know about the fate of Marcus Wellington's heroic mission. She had heard that particular combination of urgent tones only twice before in her career, both times when helicopters had gone down in conditions that left little hope for survival. Her fingers worked steadily at the lock mechanism while her mind processed the fragments of radio chatter that penetrated the thick walls of her cell. Storm Helena contact lost, search and rescue. The pieces fell into place like components in an engine rebuild, creating a picture that filled her with equal parts vindication and dread. Captain Rodriguez stood in the base command center, staring at the bank of screens that showed nothing but static where Rescue 1's signal should have been. At 52, he had seen enough military disasters to recognize the signs of a mission gone catastrophically wrong, and the weight of command seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Sir," the communications specialist reported, his young voice tight with strain. "We lost all contact approximately 15 minutes ago. Last known position was grid reference 77 degrees bearing 270 degrees. Rodriguez studied the weather radar display, watching the massive spiral of Storm Helena as it hammered the mountains where his people had vanished. The storm made search and rescue impossible. No aircraft could survive, and ground teams wouldn't reach the crash for hours. Marcus Wellington's family Name carried enough political weight to ensure that someone would eventually mount a rescue effort, but eventually might be too late for the injured survivors clinging to life on some remote mountainside. It was during this heated discussion that a radar operator noticed an anomaly on his screen, a single aircraft signature moving against the storm with purpose and precision that seemed almost supernatural. "Sir," he called out, his voice cutting through the argument like a blade, "we have an unauthorized aircraft departure from Hangar 7. Captain Rodriguez rushed to the radar console, his eyes widening as he tracked the solitary blip moving steadily into the heart of storm, Helena. "Who the hell authorized a flight in these conditions?" he demanded, already knowing that no one had been foolish enough to give such an order. The answer came from the hangar security team, the report crackling with static.
And disbelief, Sir Mechanic Harper is gone. Her cell door was open and someone took the backup. Black Hawk, without authorization. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. The woman they had locked up for interfering with Marcus.
Wellington's mission was now flying solo into the same storm that had just claimed Rescue 1. "She's either completely insane," he muttered, watching the impossible flight path on his screen, "or she's the only person on this base who actually knows what she's doing." High above the mountains, Abigail Harper fought the most difficult flight of her life through conditions that would have challenged pilots with decades more experience. The backup. Black Hawk bucked and pitched in the savage winds like a small boat in a hurricane. But her hands remained steady on the controls as she navigated by instruments and instinct. She had learned to fly by pestering the base pilots during her off-duty hours, trading mechanical work for flight lessons in a dozen different aircraft types. Now that unconventional education was the only thing standing between Marcus Wellington and a frozen grave on some unnamed peak, the crash site appeared through the swirling snow like a vision from a nightmare. The twisted wreckage of Rescue 1 perched impossibly on a ledge of rock that seemed too narrow to support a bicycle, much less a Dwist Zurich LB helicopter. Abigail could see movement in the cockpit, which meant at least some of the crew had survived the initial impact, but the precarious position of the wreck told her that any rescue attempt would have to be executed with surgical precision. A single mistake would send the damaged aircraft tumbling into the abyss, taking any survivors with it. She brought the backup helicopter into a hover just feet from the wreckage, her rotors stirring the snow into a blinding vortex that reduced visibility to mere inches. Through the chaos, she could see Marcus Wellington's face pressed against the cracked cockpit window. The same face that had mocked her just hours earlier, now transformed by terror and desperation into something almost unrecognizable. Their eyes met through the storm, and in that moment the balance of power between them shifted as fundamentally as tectonic plates realigning beneath the earth. When Marcus stumbled from the wreckage into her helicopter, his perfect uniform torn and stained with blood and hydraulic fluid, he was no longer the confident young officer who had humiliated her in front of the entire base. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong." But she cut him off with a look that could have frozen the storm itself. "Save your breath," she said, her voice carrying the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm not rescuing you because you deserve it. I'm doing it because I'm not like you." But even as she spoke those words, Abigail Harper was about to discover that their ordeal in the mountains was far from over. The backup. Black Hawk shuddered and groaned as systems began failing one by one, the victim of Marcus Wellington's earlier attempt to improve the helicopter's performance through modifications that his limited understanding had turned into sabotage. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines where he had tried to install aftermarket components, and the flight controls responded sluggishly to Abigail's increasingly desperate inputs. Jake Morrison lay unconscious in the passenger compartment, his breathing shallow and irregular, as Dr. Hayes worked to stabilize his head injury with supplies salvaged from the medical kit. The mathematics of their situation were brutally simple. They had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time remaining before the damaged helicopter would be unable to maintain altitude. Marcus cowered in the corner of the cabin, his face pale with the recognition that his earlier tampering had turned their rescue helicopter into another death trap. "I was trying to help." He stammered, his voice breaking like a child's. "I thought if I upgraded some of the components, made them more efficient." But Abigail silenced him with a gesture. Her attention focused entirely on the twisted wreckage of the original Black Hawk that lay scattered across the narrow ledge. Her engineer's mind was already working through possibilities that would have seemed impossible to anyone without her unique combination of desperate creativity and mechanical genius. "Help me move Jake to the emergency shelter," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that Marcus found himself obeying without question. Together they established a makeshift medical station in the lee of a large boulder where Dr. Hayes could continue her work while protected from the worst of the storm. The children's medicine was transferred to the same location, precious vials that represented hope for dozens of young patients who were depending on them to complete their mission. Only then did Abigail turn her attention to the seemingly impossible task that would determine whether they lived or died on this frozen mountainside. She approached the wreckage of the original helicopter with the same methodical precision she brought to any mechanical problem, her trained eyes cataloging damage and assessing salvageable components. The main rotor assembly was destroyed beyond repair, but the tail rotor remained intact and several critical engine components could be adapted to serve new purposes. Most importantly, the cheap substandard parts that Marcus had purchased to replace military-grade components could actually work to her advantage. Their lower tolerances and simplified construction would make them easier to modify and install under field conditions. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, watching in amazement as Abigail began dismantling both helicopters with tools improvised from the survival kit and debris from the crash. Her movements were swift and sure, despite the numbing cold that turned her breath to clouds of vapor and made her fingers clumsy inside her work gloves. "I'm going to build us a way home," she replied, without looking up from her work. "I'm going to take the best parts from both helicopters and create something that can fly us out of here." The task she had set herself was theoretically impossible. Combining components from two different aircraft using improvised tools in sub-zero temperatures while working against a deadline measured in the gradual weakening of Jake's vital signs. But Abigail Harper had spent her entire life proving that impossible was just another word for challenging, and she attacked the problem with the focused intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. She cannibalized the backup helicopter's engine to replace the damaged components in the original aircraft, using Marcus's inferior parts as adapters and interfaces that military regulations would never have allowed. Marcus watched in growing amazement as the woman he had dismissed as just a mechanic performed feats of engineering that bordered on miraculous. She welded critical joints using a cutting torch improvised from the helicopter's emergency oxygen system, and she fabricated replacement parts from pieces of the aircraft's own structure. Her grandfather's pilot badge caught the light as she worked, a constant reminder of the legacy she carried and the standards she was determined to uphold. "You're actually doing it," Marcus whispered. His voice filled with an awe that he had never felt for any of the material possessions his family's wealth had provided. But Abigail was saving the most dramatic moment for last. As the hybrid helicopter began to take shape, around them she deliberately allowed Marcus to believe that her efforts were failing. She cursed convincingly as she struggled with a particularly stubborn component, and she allowed frustration to show in her voice as she announced that the engine wouldn't start. "It's not working," she said, slumping against the aircraft with apparent defeat. "I can't get the power systems to integrate properly." Marcus, true to his nature, couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. "See," he said, with returning confidence, "women just cry when it gets hard. This is exactly why." His words died in his throat as Abigail pressed the ignition sequence and the hybrid helicopter roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Every system she had rebuilt functioned perfectly, from the improvised engine management computer to the jury-rigged flight controls that responded to her touch like extensions of her own will. "Surprise you, fool?" she said with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. The storm winds whipped snow around them in a vortex of white fury, but the helicopter held steady against the mountain ledge, its rotors beating with the rhythm of controlled power as they loaded Jake into the passenger compartment and prepared for the most dangerous takeoff of their lives. Marcus Wellington experienced a moment of profound revelation. The woman he had humiliated and dismissed had just accomplished something that trained engineers with unlimited resources would have considered impossible. She had taken control not just of the situation, but of the fundamental laws of physics and probability that governed their survival. And as the hybrid Black Hawk lifted off from the mountain ledge with the grace of a bird taking flight, Marcus realized that he had lost more than his arrogance in the mountains of Storm Helena. He had lost any illusion that his money and connections made him superior to the people who did the real work of the world. The flight back to Fort Blackston through the heart of storm, Helena tested every skill that Abigail Harper had acquired during her years of unofficial flight training and mechanical innovation. The hybrid helicopter responded to her commands with the precision of a fine instrument, but the storm seemed determined to claim them as its final victims. Winds that gusted to over 170 mph tried to tear the aircraft apart, while ice formed on the rotor blades with frightening speed, threatening to destroy the delicate balance that kept them airborne. But Abigail flew with the confidence of someone who had already achieved the impossible. Her hands steady on the controls as she navigated through conditions that would have challenged pilots with 10 times her experience. In the passenger compartment, Dr. Hayes continued her desperate work to keep Jake Morrison alive using equipment and techniques that pushed the boundaries of emergency medicine. His vital signs fluctuated wildly as the helicopter bucked and pitched through the storm, but the doctor's skilled hands never wavered from their task. The precious cargo of children's medicine remained secure in its specially designed containers, each vial representing hope for young patients whose lives hung in the balance. Marcus Wellington sat in stunned silence, his earlier arrogance replaced by a growing understanding of just how completely he had misjudged the woman who was now saving
all their lives. The radio crackled to life as they approached the base perimeter, Captain Rodriguez's voice cutting through the static with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Black Hawk 27, this is Fort Blackstone Tower. Please confirm your identity
and status." Abigail keyed the microphone with one hand while maintaining control of the aircraft with the other, her voice calm and professional. Despite the chaos around them, Tower, this is Mechanic. Harper, in the backup aircraft, I have Rescue 1. Survivors aboard including one critical casualty requiring immediate medical attention. Request priority landing clearance and medical team standing by. The silence that followed her transmission spoke volumes about the shock rippling through the base command structure. The woman they had arrested for interfering with Marcus Wellington's mission was now returning as the hero of her own rescue operation, having accomplished what trained search and rescue teams couldn't even attempt. Mechanic. Harper Rodriguez replied, his voice carefully controlled. You are cleared for immediate landing on Pad 7. Medical team is standing by. But even as he spoke those words, the captain was already calculating the political earthquake that would follow. Abigail's impossible success. The landing was perfect, a textbook approach that placed the hybrid helicopter exactly where the medical team could provide immediate assistance to Jake Morrison. As the rotors spun down and the storm raged overhead, Abigail Harper stepped out of the aircraft that she had literally built from the wreckage of disaster. Her coveralls were still stained with oil from Marcus's earlier humiliation, but now those stains seemed like badges of honor rather than marks
of shame. The crowd that gathered around the landing pad included many of the same people who had laughed when Marcus threw her maintenance report to the floor, but their expressions now showed a mixture of awe and shame that spoke to the magnitude
of her achievement. Marcus Wellington emerged from the helicopter like a man awakening from a nightmare. His perfect uniform now torn and stained with the reality of survival. The fake medals on his chest seemed to weigh him down as he faced the crowd of fellow officers and enlisted personnel who had witnessed his humiliation and Abigail's triumph. For the first time in his privileged life, he understood what it meant to be truly small in the presence of genuine greatness. Without prompting, from anyone, he reached up and began removing the purchase decorations from his uniform, his hands trembling as he acknowledged the lie he had been living. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the crowd despite the howling wind, "I need to tell you the truth about what happened today." The CNN news crew, which had been preparing to document his triumphant return, quickly redirected their cameras as they sensed a story even more compelling than the heroic rescue they had expected to cover. Abigail Harper saved our lives today after I ignored her warnings and put everyone at risk through my arrogance and incompetence. She is the real hero here, and I am deeply ashamed
of how I treated her. The medal ceremony that followed was unlike anything Fort Blackstone had ever witnessed. Abigail Harper walked into the hangar wearing the same oil-stained coveralls she had worn during the rescue, her hair still damp with the
melted snow and her hands bearing the cuts and burns of her mechanical work. The contrast with Marcus's expensive dress uniform could not have been more stark, but every person in that hangar understood who deserved their respect and admiration. When the base commander pinned the Medal of Honor for heroism on her coveralls, the sound of applause was thunderous, not the polite clapping of military ceremony, but the genuine appreciation of people who recognized extraordinary courage and skill. "I don't need titles or special recognition," Abigail said, when offered a field promotion to officer rank. Her voice carried across the hushed hangar with the quiet authority of someone who had proven herself in the most demanding circumstances possible. "I just need people to understand that I can control a Black Hawk helicopter better than anyone on this base." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, acknowledging not just her technical skill, but the way she had taken control of a situation that would have defeated lesser people. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus Wellington approached Abigail with the hesitant steps of someone seeking forgiveness from a person they had deeply wronged. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm that still raged outside. "But I want you to know that I understand now you didn't just save our lives today. You showed me what real leadership looks like." Abigail studied his face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse where arrogance had once lived. "The first lesson in real leadership," she replied, "is learning to respect the people who do the work." And as Storm Helena finally began to weaken in the early hours of the following morning, Abigail Harper knew that she had not just survived a crisis, she had fundamentally changed the way her world operated. 6 months after Storm Helena Fort Blackstone bore little resemblance to the base where Abigail Harper had once knelt to pick uptorn maintenance reports. While Marcus Wellington laughed with his privileged friends, the main hangar had been renamed Harper Memorial Hangar, its gleaming sign serving as a daily reminder that true heroism came from skill and courage rather than wealth and connections. Inside that hangar, 20 young women from across the country worked alongside experienced mechanics and pilots, learning the skills that would make them the next generation of military aviation specialists. The Harper Flight program had attracted national attention and substantial funding, transforming from Abigail's personal vision into a model for military education. Programs nationwide, Abigail herself had undergone her own transformation, though she insisted on maintaining the hands-on approach that had always defined her character. As the director of the program that bore her name, she could have moved into an administrative office and delegated the technical work to subordinates. Instead, she spent her mornings teaching engine maintenance to students who ranged in age from 18 to 35, and her afternoons leading flight training exercises that pushed both aircraft and pilots to their limits. Her grandfather's pilot badge still adorned her coveralls, but now it was joined by the Medal of Honor that she wore with quiet pride rather than ostentatious display. Emily Watson represented everything that Abigail hoped to accomplish through her program. At 19, the young woman from rural Alabama possessed the same combination of natural, mechanical aptitude and determined spirit that had carried Abigail through her own difficult journey. Like her mentor, Emily had grown up poor, learning to fix engines out of necessity rather than choice, and she brought to her studies an intensity that impressed even the most demanding instructors. Remember, Abigail told her during a particularly challenging lesson on hydraulic systems, "Don't let anyone tell you that you can't take control of your own destiny." Or the most remarkable transformation belonged to Marcus Wellington, whose journey from privileged antagonist to dedicated student had become the subject of considerable discussion throughout the military community. He had voluntarily surrendered his purchased officer's commission and requested assignment as an enlisted mechanic under Abigail's supervision, a decision that had shocked his wealthy family and delighted the base personnel who remembered his earlier arrogance. Now he spent his days learning the fundamental skills that he had once dismissed as beneath his notice, his expensive manicure replaced by the calloused hands of someone who actually worked for a living. "Be careful with that rotor assembly," Emily called out with barely concealed amusement as Marcus struggled with a particularly stubborn bearing housing. "You might break the helicopter again." The laughter that followed was good-natured rather than cruel, but Marcus understood that he would probably never fully escape the consequences of his earlier behavior. He had discovered that earning genuine respect was far more difficult than purchasing the appearance of authority, but also infinitely more satisfying. Under Abigail's patient guidance, he was slowly developing into the kind of person he had always pretended to be. Jake Morrison had made a complete recovery from his injuries, though he often joked that the experience had knocked some sense into his head, along with causing the concussion. As the base's new chief pilot, he worked closely with Abigail to develop training programs that emphasized both technical excellence and practical problem-solving skills. "She's created something special here," he often told visitors who came to observe the Harper program in action. "These young women aren't just learning to fly helicopters, they're learning to think like engineers and leaders." The success of the program had attracted attention from military leaders and civilian educators across the country, leading to congressional hearings and policy changes that opened doors for women in previously male-dominated military specialties. Abigail found herself invited to speak at universities and military meetings, sharing her story with audiences who were inspired by her example of perseverance and achievement. But she always insisted that the real heroes were the students who chose to challenge themselves and the instructors who dedicated their careers to developing the next generation of military professionals. On a crisp autumn morning, as Abigail watched a formation of Black Hawks piloted entirely by Harper program graduates execute a perfect training exercise, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared, angry young woman who had knelt in oil and humiliation seemed like someone from another lifetime, replaced by a confident leader who had learned to channel her pain into positive change. Marcus approached quietly, his own transformation evident in the respectful way he waited for permission to speak. "Thank you," he said simply, "for teaching me what real control means." Abigail smiled as she watched her students bank their aircraft into the morning sun, their formation tight and professional, as they demonstrated skills that would serve them throughout their military careers. "You learned the most important lesson of all," she replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had fought for every achievement. "Sometimes you have to give up control to truly be in control." With the Harper program represented more than just a training initiative. It stood as proof that real strength didn't come from crushing others, but from lifting them up to achieve heights they had never thought possible. As the helicopters disappeared into the distance, their rotor sounds fading into the everyday noise of a busy military base, Abigail Harper touched her grandfather's pilot badge and whispered a quiet promise to the future. The simple woman who had once been dismissed as just a mechanic had taken control of far more than a Black Hawk helicopter. She had taken control of her own destiny and used it to change the world for everyone who would follow in her footsteps. And in hangars and flight schools across the country, young women who had never dreamed of military careers were discovering that they too could learn to fly. You watched it, you felt it. Now share it with someone who loves drama even more than you.